Port Stanley Airfield, the 1st of May, 1982, 4:40 in the morning, local time. A beautiful Falklands night, unusually mild for late autumn, no wind. In 90 seconds, the man in this control tower will hear a sound that his Air Force's entire doctrine says cannot exist. In 90 seconds, an 8,000-mile distance will disappear, and a war he thought his country had already won will begin all over again. He does not know that yet. His name is Alberto Iannariello, Major, Argentine Air Force, 40 years old, career officer, experienced air traffic controller. His rifle leans against the wall. His helmet sits on the floor next to it. On the desk in front of him, a cup of coffee has gone cold. He has been on this airfield for 4 weeks, since the 2nd of April, when his country took these islands back from the British. In all that time, the only aircraft he has handled have been his own, a Pucará light attack plane or two, a Hercules transport running supplies up from the mainland, a trainer, a patrol boat spotting for a submarine that never came. The British are 8,000 miles away. Everyone on this airfield knows the arithmetic of distance. Everyone in Buenos Aires knows it. The Royal Navy Task Force is somewhere out at sea, perhaps 200 miles to the east. Their Sea Harriers had only a limited combat radius, far too short to threaten Port Stanley from distant waters without carrier support. The British have no aircraft carrier capable of operating a heavy bomber. They have no friendly airbase within range of these islands. They have, as far as the Argentine High Command is concerned, no way to bring a serious weight of bombs to the Falklands by air. So when the long-range radar of Air Defense Battery 601 paints a contact 30 miles out and closing, the duty officer does not call for fire. He calls for clarification. There must be a friendly transport in the area, he says. A late Hercules, perhaps a Neptune patrol aircraft. He asks again, 2 minutes later. The answer is the same. There is no possible attacker. There cannot be a possible attacker. In the tower, Major Iannariello hears something he has trained his entire adult life to recognize, something he has no business hearing here. The deep, low note of a heavy jet engine over the South Atlantic. He sits up. This is not a story about one cratered runway at the bottom of the world. It is not a story about a single bomb in a stick of 21. This is a story about how, in the space of about 90 seconds, the Argentine Air Force discovered that the most important number in the war they had just started was not the distance between Buenos Aires and Port Stanley. It was the distance the British were prepared to fly to be heard. Argentina is a long country. From Buenos Aires to the southern tip of Tierra del Fuego is more than 1,000 miles. The Argentine Air Force, the Fuerza Aérea Argentina, had built its doctrine around defending that geography. By Latin American standards, it was a serious force. Mirage, 3 fighters bought from France, a 4 Skyhawks bought from the United States, a small fleet of super étendards bought from Dassault for the Navy, fitted with Exocet anti-ship missiles. Professional, well-trained, and in the view of its commander, sober about what it could and could not do. Brigadier General Basilio Lamidoso was 52 years old in the spring of 1982, a member of the ruling military junta, and of the 3 service chiefs who had signed off on the invasion of the Falklands. He had been the most reluctant. The Navy had wanted the islands. The Army had been prepared to take them. The Air Force, when asked, had pointed quietly at a map. The islands lay 400 miles east of the Argentine coast. the Mirage. 3 carried no aerial refueling probe. From its bases at Rio Gallegos and San Julian on the southern coast, a Mirage could reach the Falklands and have, at most, 5 minutes of fuel over the islands before it had to turn for home or run dry over the ocean. 5 minutes. Pause on that sentence and 5 minutes of fuel over the disputed airspace. That was the operational envelope. The Air Force planners knew it. They told their superiors. The invasion went ahead anyway. But here is what the Argentine planners did get right. They were not wrong about range. They were not wrong about geography. They were not wrong about the brute mathematics of jet fuel and combat radius. What they were wrong about was the assumption that the British were bound by the same arithmetic. There is a small, mostly forgotten detail from the months before the invasion, which makes what is coming even sharper. In late 1981, Argentina had been quietly negotiating with the British government to buy a small number of Avro Vulcan bombers, 6 airframes, perhaps 12, taken out of Royal Air Force service as the type retired, sold to the Fuerza Aérea Argentina as a strategic long-range strike asset. On the 29th of January, 1982, the British Embassy in Buenos Aires sent a telegram to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. They asked whether the sale should proceed. On the 2nd of February, the reply came back. The sale, they wrote, should be opposed. The Vulcan, they noted, could be used to threaten the Falklands. Read that line again. 2 months before the war, the British government privately concluded that the Vulcan could threaten the Falklands. 2 months before the war, the Argentine government wanted to buy one. 2 months later, the Argentine government would find out exactly what the British had been talking about. The Argentine model worked perfectly until it didn't. 6,000 miles north of Port Stanley, on a barren volcanic island called Ascension, a single runway built by the Americans in 1942 was about to become, briefly, the busiest airfield in the world. The station manager was a man named Don Coffey. Pan Am's operating contract for Wide Awake Airfield allowed for 285 aircraft movements per year. At the peak of what was coming, Wide Awake would handle more than 300 movements in a single day. Coffey telephoned his counterpart at Chicago O'Hare to confirm the number. And on that runway, in the last week of April 1982, sat a fleet of aircraft that 6 months earlier had been scheduled for the scrapyard. The Avro Vulcan B-2 was a Cold War weapon, a delta-winged strategic bomber designed in the early 1950s to deliver a nuclear weapon to Moscow. 4 Olympus engines, a bomb bay sized for a single very large bomb. Originally the British free-fall hydrogen weapon, the Yellow Sun. Later the Blue Steel standoff missile. The Vulcan had stood Britain's nuclear watch through the worst years of the Cold War. It had sat at 4-minute readiness during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It had been part of the airborne deterrent until the Royal Navy's Polaris submarines took the strategic role over in 1969. After that, the Vulcan had been demoted. From nuclear strike to conventional bombing, from high-altitude delivery to low-level penetration of Soviet air defenses in Central Europe, from the centerpiece of British deterrence to a supporting role. And in November 1981, the British government had announced the type's retirement. By March 1982, only 3 squadrons remained, all of them at RAF Waddington in Lincolnshire, all of them due to disband by the 1st of July. 1982. The Fuerza Aérea's invasion happened on the 2nd of April. The Vulcan fleet had 11 weeks to live. What happened in the next 13 days at RAF Waddington is the part of this story that is hardest to believe, and the part that the official records mostly confirm. On the 5th of April, the order went out. reinstate the air-to-air refueling capability on a small number of Vulcans. The capability had been removed from operational use roughly 10 years earlier. The probes themselves were, in many cases, still fitted, but the plumbing behind them had been disconnected, capped off, in some cases removed entirely and given to other aircraft. The Nimrod, the Hercules. A worldwide search began for the missing parts. Engineers went through gate guardians, museum exhibits, retired airframes parked on Royal Air Force scrapyards. A team was reportedly sent to a United States Air Force base in California to remove a refueling probe from a Vulcan on outdoor display, a vital component. According to one widely told account that the RAF museum repeats with a degree of caution, had been serving as an ashtray in the officers' mess at Waddington. Bomb racks were brought back from a scrapyard in Newark on Trent. Inertial navigation units, the Delco Carousel, were taken from stored British Airways 5C-10 airliners. The crews had not practiced air-to-air refueling in 20 years. They had not practiced conventional bombing in 10. They had 13 days. There is one more thing you have to understand about Waddington that April, and it is the thing that makes what comes next feel almost impossible. The men at RAF Waddington had been preparing, in April 1982, for the disbandment ceremonies. The squadrons were sending out their farewell dinners, planning their parades, getting ready to drop their squadron colors. Senior pilots were signing their retirement papers. Ground crew were applying for civilian jobs. There was a kind of melancholy ritual underway, the slow shutdown of a fleet that had carried Britain's deterrent for a quarter of a century. Then, in the middle of that ritual, with no warning, the war came. Engineers who had been preparing to retire alongside their aircraft found themselves working 16-hour days. Crews who had been transitioning to other types, the Buccaneer, the Tornado just entering service, were pulled back to relearn their old trade. A handful of older pilots, including the V-Force veteran squadron leader John Reeve and an experienced captain named Flight Lieutenant Martin Withers, were nominated for the long flight south. At the Ministry of Defense in London, a government mathematician named James Moffat was given 72 hours to calculate the optimal number of bombs to drop. He phoned the British construction firm that had originally built the runway at Port Stanley. He took the concrete specifications to the Royal Aircraft Establishment. He applied the wartime statistical method developed by the physicist Patrick Blackett in 1942. 3 numbers came out the other side. With 7 bombs, the chance of 1 hit on the runway was acceptable. With 14, it was good. With 21, the maximum the bomb bay would hold. The chance of at least 1 crater on the runway was 90%. 21 bombs. On the night of the 30th of April, 2 Vulcans rolled to the end of the runway at wide awake behind a long line of Victor tankers. 13 aircraft in total, 11 Victors, 2 Vulcans. The primary bomber was XM598, captained by squadron leader John Reeve. The reserve was XM607, captain, Flight Lieutenant Martin Withers. He did not yet know that he was about to set a world record. He did not yet know that 6,000 miles to the south, in a control tower at the bottom of the world, a major in the Argentine Air Force was about to hear a sound that his entire doctrine said could not exist. He only knew what the briefing officer had told him, that the primary would go first, that the reserve would follow, that if either aircraft turned back, the other would carry the war alone. 10:45 in the evening, the 30th of April, 1982, Ascension Island. Wide Awake Airfield sits in near total darkness. Runway lights burn low. The volcanic ash of the island reflects nothing. A South Atlantic wind moves across the parking apron, warm and steady, carrying the smell of jet fuel and rubber in the sea. XM598 taxis first. Squadron leader John Reeve, 40 years old, at the controls, a V-Force veteran, 23 years in Bomber Command. He had been 3 months from retirement when the war came. Behind him, XM607, Flight Lieutenant Martin Withers, 35, quiet man, 2 children at home in Lincolnshire. He does not expect to fly tonight. He has not slept properly in 6 days. He is the reserve. 11 Victor tankers follow. Their crews have been briefed for 6 hours. The refueling plan, drawn up by Wing Commander Jeremy Price, is a cascade. Tankers, refueling tankers, refueling tankers, refueling the bomber. Each Victor peeling off and turning back for home as its own fuel runs low. Each new tanker stepping forward with the fuel of the one before. By the time the bomber reaches its target, the fuel in its tanks will have passed through 5 other aircraft. Reeve lifts off first, then Withers, then the Victors, one after another, into a moonless sky over the South Atlantic. Withers climbs to 27,000 feet, levels off. Behind him, in the cramped rear compartment of the Vulcan, 4 men sit at their stations. Flying Officer Peter Taylor, 28, CO pilot. Flight Lieutenant Bob Wright, Navigator Radar. Flight Lieutenant Gordon Graham, Navigator Plotter. Flight Lieutenant Hugh Pryor, Air Electronics Officer. And on the jump seat, a 6th man, Squadron Leader Dick Russell, 40 years old, refueling instructor, borrowed from the Victor fleet. He is here because the Vulcan crews have practiced air-to-air refueling for less than 2 weeks. They will refuel 4 times on the way south. Russell will take the controls each time. 20 minutes into the flight, the first thing goes wrong. In the cockpit of XM598, the primary bomber, Squadron Leader Reeve feels a sharp change of pressure against his left ear. The rubber seal on his direct vision side window, the small opening panel beside the pilot's seat, has failed. Cold air roars into the cockpit. The cabin cannot pressurize. The aircraft is too heavy to land with a full bomb load. Reeve does the math in seconds. He cannot climb. He cannot fight the leak. He cannot bomb. He turns for home. Somewhere behind him, in the darkness, a young voice comes over the intercom of XM607. Withers listens. Russell listens. Taylor listens. Then the message from the mission commander confirms it. The primary is turning back. Withers, on the reserve, is now the mission. Years later, in an interview given for the 40th anniversary of the raid, Withers described the moment. Suddenly, he said, "We realized we were the ones who were expected to fly all the way down and bomb Stanley Airfield. This came as a bit of a shock, but we were prepared." The first refueling comes 40 minutes later. A Victor rolls into position ahead and above the Vulcan. The refueling drogue, a basket at the end of a long hose, streams behind the tanker in the slipstream. Russell takes the controls. He guides the Vulcan's probe into the basket with the precision of a man who has done this 1,000 times. Because he has, fuel flows. The Victor peels off, turns north, home. The second refueling, 2 hours in, another Victor, another basket, another transfer of fuel, another aircraft peeling off into the dark. The third refueling. The cascade is working. Now they are more than 2,000 miles from Ascension, deeper into the South Atlantic than any V-Force aircraft has ever flown. And now the weather changes. at 30 degrees south latitude, over open ocean, in the middle of the night. XM607 flies into a line of thunderheads, cumulonimbus cloud, 10 miles high, black on black in the dark. Static electricity dances across the windscreen. Turbulence hammers the airframe. The bomber climbs and drops in violent, unpredictable steps. The final outbound refueling is scheduled inside this weather. The plan is this. Victor XH669, captained by Flight Lieutenant Steve Biglands, will receive a top-up of fuel from Victor XL189, captained by Squadron Leader Bob Tuxford. Then Biglands will pull ahead and pass that fuel onto Withers. Simple, choreographed, rehearsed. In the storm, it comes apart. Biglands eases his Victor into the basket streaming behind Tuxford's aircraft. Contact. Fuel begins to flow. Then the turbulence hits. The two aircraft buck. The refueling probe on Biglands' Victor snaps clean off inside the basket of Tuxford's tanker. Both men see it happen. Both men understand what it means in the same second. Without a probe, Biglands cannot take on any more fuel, which means he cannot pass fuel on to the Vulcan, which means the entire mission, everything. The 13 days of scavenging parts from museums and scrapyards, the 72 hours of ballistic calculation, the 11 tankers, the 6 men in XM607, is now 4,000 pounds of jet fuel short of Port Stanley. The plan is broken. Radio silence has been ordered. No one on the fleet can call for help. No one can call for guidance. Every man on every aircraft must solve the problem in his own cockpit in the next 60 seconds. Behind Biglands and Tuxford, in the darkness of the storm, Squadron Leader Bob Tuxford, 36 years old, does something for which he will later be awarded the Air Force Cross. He speaks to Biglands, voice steady. He tells Biglands to give the fuel back. The two Victors realign. This time the roles are reversed. Tuxford takes back the fuel he had transferred moments earlier. Biglands, with no probe, is done. He turns for ascension. And Tuxford, now carrying the fuel that was supposed to go through Biglands, takes over the final refueling of the Vulcan himself. He does the mathematics in his head. He knows what it means. If he gives the Vulcan the fuel it needs to reach Port Stanley, he will not have enough fuel to reach ascension. He will run out, somewhere over the South Atlantic, in the dark, alone. He gives the fuel to the Vulcan. He gives less than the plan required, because that is all he has. Withers, in XM607, receives a transfer of fuel several thousand pounds short of what he was supposed to get. Enough to reach the target, not enough for the return leg to be comfortable. The Vulcan peels off. Tuxford watches it go. Then Tuxford and his 4 crewmen, Flight Lieutenant Glenn Reese, Squadron Leader Ernie Wallace, Flight Lieutenant John Keeble, and Flight Lieutenant Mick Beer, turn north, toward an island they know they cannot reach. The radio silence rules of the mission prevent Tuxford from calling for help. Not yet, if he transmits. The Argentine listening posts on the mainland will triangulate his position, and from that, they will deduce the position of the Vulcan. The mission takes priority. He must wait. For 4 hours, XL189 flies north through the storm, fuel bleeding away in the tanks. 5 men in the cockpit staring at gauges they have never seen this low. Wallace calculates the point of no return. It is already passed. They no longer have the fuel to reach ascension. They no longer have the fuel to reach any friendly airfield. They are flying toward a dot in an ocean with no other options. Tuxford does not break silence. Not yet. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles further south, XM607 is beginning her final approach. The Falkland Islands rise out of the black ocean ahead. No lights. Blackout regulations have been enforced on Port Stanley for 4 weeks. The town lies dark under a moonless sky. The airfield lies dark. The Argentine garrison sleeps. Withers takes the Vulcan down to 10,000 feet. Then, lower. Flight Lieutenant Hugh Pryor, at the electronic warfare panel, activates the 2 ALQ-101 electronic countermeasures pods that have been fitted to the Vulcan's underwing pylons in the last week. The pods have been scavenged from the RAF's Buccaneer fleet. No Vulcan has ever carried them before. Pryor does not know for certain that they will work. They work. On the ground at Port Stanley, the Skyguard fire control radars of Air Defense Battery 601 go blind. Where there should be an aircraft, there is only noise. In the operations room, the duty officer sees the long-range search radar contact. 30 miles out, he calls for clarification. He is told to hold fire. He calls again. He is told to hold fire. He calls a third time. There is no possible attacker. In the tower, Major Alberto Iannariello sits deep in thought. He hears an engine sound that does not belong. He begins to sit up. Bob Wright, navigator radar, calls the run-in. Withers holds the aircraft steady. The bomb bay doors open. 21 bombs, each weighing 1,000 pounds, arranged in a stick calculated by James Moffett 3 weeks earlier, drop through the doors in sequence. They fall for the better part of a minute. Then, at 4:40 in the morning, on the 1st of May, 1982, they begin to strike the runway. Iannariello, in the tower, later gave his account to the historian Martin Middlebrook. Middlebrook wrote the book, Fight for the Malvinas, from interviews with Argentine officers and conscripts after the war. Iannariello's words are on the page. I was sitting in an armchair in the control tower, he said, deep in thought, when the explosion of the first bomb suddenly shook me back to reality. I found myself facing a red cloud which swept toward the tower, smashing all the window panes and shaking the building. When I came round, I was under the armchair. I went outside as quickly as possible with my rifle and helmet, and I found a chaotic situation. People running here and there, the red flashes of our anti-aircraft guns exploding in the sky. It was our baptism of fire. 6 words. It was our baptism of fire. The Argentine Air Force had been at war on paper for 4 weeks. It had not, until that moment, been fired upon by a strategic bomber. 3 young Argentine conscripts lost their lives that morning. Their names were Guillermo Ubaldo Garcia, Hector Ramon Bordon, Raul Ricardo Romero. 2 of them were Air Force conscripts. The third was a young man serving with the Navy. They were the first Argentine combat deaths of the air war. They were 18, 20, and 21 years old. Their names are on the wall of the monument to the fallen in the Malvinas in Buenos Aires. They should be named here as well. Withers turned XM607 north, radioed the code word, superfuse, bomb run complete. Now the Vulcan had 4,000 miles to fly, and less fuel than the plan had required, and a tanker aircraft somewhere ahead of her, holding radio silence, running out of options. Bob Tuxford, in Victor XL 189, heard the code word come through his headset. Then, and only then, did he break silence. He put out a call for an emergency rescue tanker, 600 miles north of Ascension. In the pre-dawn dark, Wing Commander Colin Seymour, Tuxford's own squadron commander, was already in his aircraft. He had been sitting on the runway for hours. He had been waiting for a call he hoped would never come. Victor XL 511 lifted off from Wide Awake at full power. Seymour turned south. The two aircraft found each other 400 miles out. Tuxford had 30 minutes of fuel left in his tanks. He hooked into Seymour's basket. Fuel flowed, enough to reach the island. Tuxford landed at Wide Awake shortly before 1 in the afternoon. Zulu time, 14 hours and 5 minutes after takeoff. His crew climbed down from the aircraft in silence. Wallace, the navigator, walked to the edge of the parking apron and sat down on the concrete. He did not speak for a long time. Somewhere behind them, still 2 hours out, Martin Withers was flying XM 607 north through the dawn. He did not yet know that Tuxford had made it home. He did not yet know that the message he had delivered, the message his bombs had carried, was already being processed in a bunker beneath Buenos Aires. He only knew that he was low on fuel, that the coast of Africa was a very long way away, and that a tanker, somewhere ahead of him in the light, was climbing to meet him. 2:52 in the afternoon, Zulu time, the 1st of May, 1982. XM 607 touched down on the runway at Wide Awake, 15 hours and 45 minutes after she had lifted off from the same strip of concrete the previous evening. The longest bombing mission in the history of aerial warfare. Up to that point in time, Martin Withers taxied the Vulcan to the parking apron, shut down the engines, sat in the cockpit for a moment with his hands on the yoke, then unstrapped. The ground crew were waiting. Someone had brought a tray of beer cans out to the aircraft. Someone else had brought a camera. Peter Taylor climbed down first, then Wright, then Graham, then Pryor, then Russell, then Withers. 6 men who had been in a metal tube for almost 16 hours. None of them said very much. 1,500 miles to the west, in a bunker beneath the city of Buenos Aires. The report was already on its way up the chain of command. The airfield at Port Stanley had been struck, from the air, by a heavy bomber. The initial reaction, according to accounts later given by Argentine officers to journalists and historians, was disbelief. There had to be a mistake. A Hercules, perhaps, that had crashed on landing. An ammunition dump that had cooked off. A ship offshore firing shells that had been misidentified as bombs. The idea that a British strategic bomber had flown from Ascension Island to the Falklands and back was not, at first, believed. Because it could not be believed. Because the numbers said it was impossible. The confirmation came within hours. Crater diameter, bomb fragments, fuse types. Every piece of evidence pointed the same direction. The British had done what the British were not supposed to be able to do. And now, Brigadier General Basilio Lamidoso, commander of the Fuerza Aérea Argentina, had a decision to make. If the British could reach Port Stanley from Ascension Island, they could reach the Argentine mainland from Ascension Island. They could reach the air bases at Rio Gallegos and San Julian, from which the Skyhawks and Mirages of the Fuerza Aérea flew their missions against the Royal Navy Task Force. They could, in theory, reach Buenos Aires itself. Whether they actually would was a separate question. Whether they actually could sustain such a campaign, night after night, given how many tankers and how much fuel and how much institutional muscle a single black buck raid had cost, was a separate question again. But Lamidoso could not know the answers to those questions. He could not know that the British tanker force had been strained almost to breaking point. He could not know that Bob Tuxford had come home with 30 minutes of fuel in his tanks. He could not know how many more of these raids the Royal Air Force could actually fly before the whole improvised machine ran out of parts and pilots and time. He could only see what had happened. And in war, what you cannot rule out is what you must plan for. Within days of the raid, a small number of Mirage 3 fighters, perhaps 4 airframes, were withdrawn from the southern bases at Rio Gallegos and San Julian. They were flown north to defend the air defense zone around Buenos Aires. Several Mirage 3 fighters were redeployed north to strengthen the air defense of Buenos Aires. They would spend the rest of the war sitting on runways near the capital, waiting for a raid that would never come. Their absence from the south was real. It eased the burden on the Royal Navy Sea Harriers in the weeks of fighting that lay ahead. It shifted, by a small but measurable margin, the odds in the sky over San Carlos water, where British troops would soon come ashore. This is the part of the story where the historian's voice has to be honest with you, because it would be very easy, at this point, to tell you that Black Buck won the air war, or that Black Buck saved the Royal Navy, or that Black Buck brought Argentina to the negotiating table. None of those things is true. The single crater on the runway at Port Stanley was repaired by Argentine engineers in about 24 hours. Only one of the 21 bombs Withers had dropped had struck the runway itself. The other 20 had cratered the grass around it. The strip stayed operational. Argentine 130 transports continued to fly into Port Stanley almost until the end of the war. They simply retimed their movements to avoid the pre-dawn window when the Vulcans came. The official British history of the Falklands campaign was written by the historian Lawrence Freedman. It runs to 2 thick volumes. Freedman notes, carefully, that the lasting significance of the Black Buck raids remains a subject of debate among military historians. Admiral Sandy Woodward, who commanded the aircraft carrier battle group from HMS Hermes, wrote in his memoir, 100 Days, that he had never expected the raid to stop the transport flights and did not greatly care about them, since C-130s were not a threat to his ships. Commander Nigel Ward, known as Sharky, who led the Sea Harrier Squadron on Invincible, was even franker. The idea that a lone Vulcan raid would have deterred Argentina from air attacks on the mainland, he wrote, was, in his words, baloney. So Black Buck did not, on its own, win the war. The Sea Harrier pilots flying off Hermes and Invincible won parts of it. The Royal Marines and the Paras and the Scots Guards on the ground won parts of it. The men of the Royal Navy in San Carlos water paid for parts of it in blood and in ships. Numerous British ships were hit or damaged. 6 were lost, including HMS Sheffield, HMS Ardent, HMS Antelope, HMS Coventry, RFA Sir Galahad, and the merchant ship Atlantic Conveyor. 255 British service personnel died. 649 Argentine service personnel died. Those were the men who won the war. But Black Buck did do one thing. Air Marshal Sir John Curtis, who commanded the RAF air operations during the campaign, put it as carefully as anyone has. Speaking at a seminar at the RAF Museum at Hendon in 2003, he said this: "The Black Buck operations delivered a crucial message. A message that was clearly understood in Argentina. They were therefore an essential undertaking, and they did play their part in supporting the operations of the task force. The message was that the Falklands were no longer 8,000 miles from anywhere. That Black Buck demonstrated that distance alone could no longer be relied upon as a defense. That a country which, on the 2nd of April, had taken islands it believed to be safely beyond the reach of British air power, had, by the 1st of May, been forced to redeploy fighters to defend its own capital, because the air power they had ruled out had arrived anyway. Withers was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his part in the raid. Tuxford was awarded the Air Force Cross. The rest of the Vulcan crew, Peter Taylor, Bob Wright, Gordon Graham, Hugh Pryor, and Dick Russell, were mentioned in dispatches. The total flight time logged by the Victor tanker fleet that night, across all 11 airframes, was 105 hours and 25 minutes. The Vulcan flew 6 more Black Buck missions before the war was over. The last of them, Black Buck 7, took place on the 12th of June, 1982. It was the final operational bombing raid ever flown by the Royal Air Force's Heavy Bomber Force. XM607 flew that one as well. Martin Withers once again, in the left-hand seat. 2 days later, the Argentine garrison on the Falklands laid down its arms. Martin Withers stayed in the Royal Air Force until 1991. He retired as a squadron leader. He flew commercial airliners for the rest of his working life. In 2007, at the age of 60, he came back to the Vulcan, this time as the chief pilot of the only airworthy example left in the world, XH-558, restored to flight by the Vulcan to the Sky Trust. He flew her at air shows across the United Kingdom for 4 years, before she too was retired. Bob Tuxford left the Royal Air Force as a wing commander. He wrote a memoir of that night. He called it Contact. He is, at the time of recording, still alive. The 3 Argentine conscripts who lost their lives at Port Stanley, Guillermo Ubaldo Garcia, Hector Ramon Bordon, and Raul Ricardo Romero, are named on the wall of the monument to the fallen in the Malvinas in Buenos Aires. Their families still visit that wall. XM607 sits, in 2026, under restoration on the apron at RAF Waddington. 3 small bomb motifs painted on her nose, one for each of the 3 Black Buck missions she flew. She has not been in the air since 1982. She does not need to be. There is one last thing to say about that night, and it is a thing that some of you, watching this, may have lived through yourselves. The record set by Black Buck 1, the longest bombing mission in the history of aerial warfare, held for almost 10 years. It was broken in the opening hours of the 17th of January, 1991, when B-52 Stratofortresses of the United States Air Force lifted off from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, flew to Iraq, delivered their bombs against targets in the opening hours of Operation Desert Storm, and came home, all in a single mission. Some of you remember watching that on television. The B-52 missions demonstrated a concept of long-range strike that Black Buck had dramatically showcased nearly a decade earlier. Out of desperation, in 13 days in April of 1982, long-range strike with a chain of tanker refuelings across half the world, a relay of fuel handed from aircraft to aircraft in the dark, Black Buck became one of the most remarkable demonstrations of long-range, conventional strike in modern military history, illustrating what aerial refueling could achieve. An air force built on an empire that no longer existed had taught an air force built on the empire that had replaced it how to fly further than either of them had ever flown before. 11 tankers to put one bomb on one runway at the bottom of the world. Distance was no longer a defense. That was the message. And in the small hours of the 1st of May, 1982, in a control tower at Port Stanley Airfield, a major in the Argentine Air Force, sitting on the floor with his rifle and his helmet and the broken window panes around his feet, became the first man in his country to read it.